Mel Jared Gibson, a name that, for millions of people around the world, instantly conjures images of a face streaked with blue war paint, a defiant glare beneath an old-world crown, or the weary eyes of a cop pushed to the edge. But behind that name is a life story far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more conflicted than any character he ever played. This is the story of Mel Gibson, his rise, his fall, his redemption attempts, and the quieter, often hidden truths that shaped him along the way. Let's go back, long before Hollywood, long before Braveheart, long before the scandal headlines. Back to a boy who, like so many future legends, never really planned to be one. Mel Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, into a large Irish Catholic family. He was the sixth of 11 children. 11! Imagine that. A home overflowing with siblings, voices, arguments, jokes, and the constant rolling noise of life. His father, Hutton Gibson, was an outspoken, deeply religious man with very strong, often controversial beliefs. His mother, Anne, was gentle, Irish-born, devoted to her faith, and, by all accounts, the emotional anchor of the family. The Gibson household was not a typical suburban American home. It was intense. It was strict. Religion wasn't just a Sunday ritual. It was the backbone of their worldview. The Gibson children were raised with a very clear sense of moral absolutes, sin, duty, and the looming weight of eternity. It was a house where faith, ideas, and dogma weren't casual topics. They were battles. When Mel was still a boy, his father suffered a serious work injury. Then came lawsuits, financial strain, and, as the story goes, a growing sense that America wasn't a safe or fair enough place to raise his children. Around the same time, the Vietnam War draft loomed like a shadow over American youth. Hutton, who had very strong opinions about politics, war, and the future of the United States, made a decision that would change Mel's entire life direction. He moved his family to Australia. For Mel, that decision was a turning point that never looked like a turning point. He was a kid from New York suddenly dropped into another world, Sydney, Australia. New accents, new culture, new rules. The boy who would one day become the face of rugged American masculinity actually came of age in an Australian schoolyard, being teased for his American roots. He learned to adapt, to blend, to survive socially by being quick, charming, and funny. That wit and adaptability would later become part of his star power. But at that time, he wasn't aiming for the spotlight. He wasn't dreaming of Oscar statues or blockbuster roles. One of the earliest almosts lives of Mel Gibson is that he once considered the priesthood. That's how pervasive and intense the religious atmosphere around him was. Imagine for a second the alternate timeline where Father Mel Gibson is delivering homilies in a quiet parish instead of monologues on a bloody battlefield. That path was, for a brief moment, an actual contender. His sister played a surprisingly pivotal role in his fate. She secretly sent an application for him to the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, NIDA, one of the most prestigious acting schools in Australia. Mel was working odd jobs, drifting, not particularly sure what to do next, and his sister saw something in him, a presence, a charisma, a performative spark that he hadn't fully owned yet. He auditioned. He got in. NIDA was tough. It wasn't glamour. It was grind. There, Mel Gibson trained alongside other future Australian stars, including Judy Davis. He was not instantly adored, not instantly recognized as some flawless genius. He was raw. He had talent, yes, but he also had that intangible quality, that magnetic unpredictability, that sense that something dangerous and alive was simmering behind the eyes. During those years, another part of his story quietly took shape: alcohol. The long, complicated relationship between Mel Gibson and drinking was not born in the tabloids. It started early. Stories from his younger days, both in school and on sets, describe a young man who could be charming and funny when sober, and wild, reckless, and self-destructive when drunk. That duality, that split, would shadow him for decades. His big break came in 1979 with a film that at first looked like just another low-budget Australian production, a movie nobody could have predicted would alter global action cinema, Mad Max. Mad Max was made on a shoestring budget, shot roughly, and powered by an almost punk desperation. The story of a cop in a collapsing society pushed to the brink by brutality and loss fit perfectly with Mel's particular presence. He played Max Rokitansky, and in that role he channeled something stoic, wounded, and quietly enraged. The production was intense, the stunts were real and dangerous, and the film looked and felt like nothing else. When Mad Max exploded internationally, Mel Gibson's life changed forever. Overnight, the kid from a giant Catholic family who had nearly become a priest, the transplanted American who'd been mocked in Australian schoolyards, became a new kind of action hero. Slender but lethal, quiet but explosive, with eyes that told you he'd seen too much. He followed that with work in Australian cinema that showed his range, including the war film Gallipoli in 1981, directed by Peter Weir. That film was crucial. It revealed that Mel was not just an action figure. He could do vulnerable, tragic, human. Gallipoli gave him dignity and depth, and in Australia, it cemented his status as a serious actor. But Hollywood was waiting. In the mid-1980s, Mel Gibson crossed over from Aussie star to global icon through a role that would define an entire era of buddy cop films, Martin Riggs in Lethal Weapon. Riggs was the wild card, the unhinged, suicidal cop haunted by the death of his wife. This wasn't just standard action flick machismo. Riggs was broken. He put a gun in his mouth. He cried. He snapped. He made bad jokes at the edge of breakdowns. The film needed an actor who could be both insane and lovable, violent and vulnerable. Gibson delivered. What the world didn't fully realize at first was how close some of that was to home. The untold thread behind Martin Riggs is that Mel himself was wrestling with darkness. Behind the scenes, by his own later admissions, his drinking was serious. He had blackouts. He could be rageful. He sometimes felt suicidal. The line between actor and role blurred. He understood Riggs not as a fun acting exercise, but as a reflection of a real mental abyss he'd looked into more than once. While audiences laughed and cheered, while the box office soared, and while Lethal Weapon spawned sequels and helped make Mel Gibson one of the most bankable stars in the world, an internal war was quietly festering between the devout religious upbringing and the temptations and vices of Hollywood, between the family man and the self-destructive drinker, between the version of himself adored by the public and the version that emerged in private, late at night, under the influence or under stress. In those years, Mel Gibson lived two lives. In one life, he was the charming late-night talk show guest, the hilarious storyteller, the handsome star with that mischievous grin, the action hero who could also cry on cue, the actor who could lead blockbusters like Lethal Weapon, Maverick, and Ransom, and also shine in more serious films like The Year of Living Dangerously. In the other life, there was marital strain, personal turbulence, and escalating drinking. He married Robin Moore in 1980. By many accounts, she was his grounding force, kind, steady, low-key. Together, they had 7 children. 7. While the world saw Mel as the swaggering bachelor hero on screen, he spent much of his off-camera life as a father in a big, noisy, very real family. Yet the more his star rose, the harder it became to keep the public persona and the private chaos separate. Then, in 1995, Mel Gibson made a move that would forever stamp his name into cinema history. He directed and starred in Braveheart. Braveheart is more than a movie for a lot of people. It's a mythic experience. The story of William Wallace, a Scottish warrior who led a rebellion against English rule, resonated with audiences on a deep emotional level. The film blended raw brutality with rousing speeches, historical war with almost spiritual themes of freedom, sacrifice, and identity. Gibson didn't just play Wallace symbolically, he poured his whole being into it. The battles were muddy, bloody, messy. His face streaked with blue paint, hair tangled and wild, he stood before his men and cried out, "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." What people didn't necessarily see was how personal that line was. Freedom, for Mel, was never just political. It was psychological, emotional, spiritual. He was a man desperately wanting freedom from his inner demons, his addictions, his guilt, his contradictions. Braveheart was a triumph. It won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, and in the mid-1990s, Mel Gibson stood at the summit. He had crossed the rare line from star to auteur, from hired leading man to visionary. But the higher you climb, the more exposed you become. Around this time, the public also began to hear hints about his private beliefs, especially regarding religion and his father's influence. Mel was not just Catholic. He was drawn to a very traditional, even pre-Vatican II form of Catholicism. He funded the building of his own private church, the Holy Family Chapel in Malibu, which operated independently from the official Catholic Church hierarchy. That move puzzled and worried some. It suggested that his spiritual life, already intense, was becoming increasingly separate, more insular. Behind the scenes, his drinking never fully went away. He tried to quit, he relapsed. He would later admit that he drank to numb pain, to silence the relentless noise in his head, to cope with fear, anger, and shame. Alcohol was both his escape and his prison. After Braveheart, he continued to act in big movies, but something else was brewing. He felt a calling, one that would lead him straight into the center of one of the biggest controversies in modern film history. In 2004, Mel Gibson released The Passion of the Christ. For some, it was a profound spiritual experience. For others, it was deeply troubling, even offensive. The film depicted the last hours of Jesus' life with almost unbearable brutality. It was shot in Aramaic and Latin, a bold and risky artistic choice. No major studio wanted to finance it. Mel put up tens of millions of his own money. He was betting everything, his career, his finances, his reputation, on a film that many predicted would fail, or at best be a niche religious project. They were wrong. The Passion of the Christ became a phenomenon. Church groups rented out entire theaters. Some viewers cried uncontrollably. Others walked out. Critics debated whether it was a masterpiece of religious devotion or a dangerous, inflammatory work. Accusations of anti-Semitism flared, with some arguing that the film's portrayal of certain characters could fuel ugly stereotypes. Inside Mel, the old conflict grew sharper. On one hand, he said he felt guided, almost compelled, to make this film as an expression of his faith and beliefs about suffering, redemption, and sacrifice. On the other hand, any hint of bigotry or intolerance in the work sparked outrage. The world started to ask, who is Mel Gibson really? A man of faith? A gifted artist? Or someone whose beliefs harbored darker, prejudiced elements? Behind the scenes, his personal life was unraveling even more. His marriage to Robin, his wife of decades, was under serious strain. His drinking, which had cycled through periods of sobriety and relapse, continued to haunt him. Fame, fortune, and religious conviction did not shield him from the slow-motion collapse happening internally. Then, in 2006, came the night that changed everything. Mel Gibson was arrested for drunk driving in Malibu. During the arrest, he launched into a drunken rant that included vile, anti-Semitic statements. The details would be recorded, published, and replayed endlessly. The man who once stood on Oscar stages and accepted awards with charm and grace was now at the center of a global firestorm. Public Mel and private Mel collided violently in that moment, and there was nowhere left to hide. The world was shocked, outraged, and, in some quarters, done with him. Hollywood, which had once welcomed him as a golden boy, now treated him as radioactive. Some friends defended him. Others distanced themselves. Many people who had admired his work felt betrayed. He apologized multiple times, calling his words despicable and blaming the explosion on alcoholism and deep-seated anger. But the damage was done. For a lot of people, the mask had slipped. They believed they'd seen the real Mel Gibson, and they didn't like what they saw. The untold part of this story is what happened after the headlines faded. Mel Gibson did not simply shrug it off and disappear into an island paradise. He went through something closer to a personal implosion. His marriage finally ended. He was sued, criticized, and dissected. Old controversies about his father's statements and his own beliefs resurfaced. Roles dried up. Financially, he was still powerful, but reputation-wise, he had fallen from the mountaintop to a dark valley. He went to rehab. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous. He wrestled again and again with his demons. In private, according to some who remained close to him, he was often filled with remorse, shame, and self-loathing. He felt like he had destroyed his own legacy with his own mouth, his own actions. And, in many ways, he had. Everything he had built, from Mad Max to Lethal Weapon, from Braveheart to The Passion, now existed under a long, dark shadow. He still tried to work. He directed Apocalypto in 2006, a brutal and visually stunning film set in the final days of the Maya civilization, performed in the Yucatec Maya language. Once again, he took massive artistic risks. Once again, he showed that his mind as a filmmaker was fearless and original. But this time, his brilliance was overshadowed by the scandal attached to his name. The public conversation was no longer simply about the work, it was about the man behind the camera. Then, in 2010, another incident hit the news. Leaked recordings of him in a furious argument with his then-partner Oksana Grigorieva. The tapes were ugly. They featured racist language, threats, and an explosive, frightening version of Mel Gibson at his worst. For many who had still held out hope for a clean redemption arc, this was a breaking point. The story of Mel Gibson, once one of triumph and artistic daring, now seemed to some like a cautionary tale about what happens when fame, alcohol, anger, and unhealed pain combine in a single human being. Yet the human story is rarely that simple. In the years that followed, he quietly kept going to meetings. He kept trying to stay sober. He tried to mend relationships, even if some were beyond repair. He continued to be a father to his children, including a new child from a later relationship. Friends and coworkers who interacted with him during those quieter years sometimes described a different man than the one in the headlines. Gentle, humble, even nervous, aware of his reputation, aware that every move he made would be scrutinized. He slowly, carefully began to re-enter the Hollywood world, not as the unstoppable leading man, but as a cautious figure trying to rebuild through work. One important chapter in that attempted comeback came in 2016 when he directed Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge told the true story of Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector who served in World War II as a medic and refused to carry a weapon. Instead of killing, he saved lives, rescuing men under fire. It's a story about conviction, courage, faith, and redemption in the midst of unspeakable violence. In many ways, Hacksaw Ridge was the externalization of Mel Gibson's inner contradictions, a man drawn to violence on screen who also cared deeply about themes of sacrifice and grace, a man haunted by his own past but still yearning to tell stories of heroes who refused to give up on doing the right thing. The film was a success. It earned critical acclaim and multiple Oscar nominations. For the first time in years, the conversation in Hollywood began to cautiously shift from "should he ever work again" to "can we acknowledge the power of his filmmaking while still grappling with his past?" That question remains unresolved for many people. Today, Mel Gibson stands not as the untouchable star he once was, but as a complicated figure. For some, he is unforgivable, a symbol of bigotry and rage. For others, he is a sinner striving to repent, an artist whose work still moves them deeply despite his flaws. For others still, he is a cautionary tale about how trauma, religion, addiction, ego, and fame can collide inside a single human soul. The untold story about Mel Gibson is not that there's one secret incident or hidden conspiracy that explains everything. It's that his life is the slow-burning battle between the better angels of his nature and the darker parts of his psyche. From boyhood, he was taught about sin and salvation, heaven and hell. But nobody truly taught him how to live in the middle. in the strange, messy gray area where everyday people struggle with anger, with addiction, with prejudice, with the pain they carry from their families and pasts. His father's fervent beliefs, including views that many find deeply offensive, acted like early programming in his mind. His intense religious sense of guilt and judgment, combined with Hollywood's temptations, created a storm inside him. When he drank, that storm often broke outward in destructive ways. Mel Gibson is not just the hero of Braveheart, or the tortured cop in Lethal Weapon, or the zealously committed director of The Passion of the Christ and Hacksaw Ridge. He is also the man screaming in the back of a police car, the man captured in leaked audio saying things that shock and hurt. His biography is not a simple arc of rise, fall, and clean redemption. It's a jagged line with multiple peaks and valleys, wrong turns and partial recoveries, ongoing struggles and incomplete apologies. And yet, there is another thread running through his story, his undeniable gift. He has a rare cinematic instinct for imagery, for pacing, for the emotional core of a scene. He understands how to craft battle sequences that feel both epic and excruciatingly intimate. He knows how to frame a face so that suffering becomes almost tangible to the viewer. He can, when he commits, disappear into a character with terrifying authenticity. That's the tension that refuses to neatly resolve. A man capable of creating timeless, powerful art, and a man capable of causing deep. However, I can only generate harm with his words and actions. The untold content for a single page due to technical limitations. I can provide a detailed biography, including lesser-known stories, within that scope. Would you like me to proceed with generating a single-page script covering Mel Gibson's biography and untold stories? Truth of Mel Gibson isn't about